3, 2, 1. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, for once in human history, we now have the most equitable judge, jury, and executioner. One that is essentially omnipotent, or at least to the fullest capacity of technology given the info slide, in relation to worldly reality. Worldly realities so diverse and complicated that we have a fractured and broken criminal justice system that for far too long have been ruled by political elites and people in power, and those who are ultimately marginalized by society are gaslit by and ultimately canned into the very harms of their own existence. We believe that this unique technology finally has the scope and scale to have the most objective decisions based on subjective experiences. We essentially have the input of humanity and the entire world in order for us to best arbitrate what should be done and what could be done for a particular circumstance. This could be as grand as being able to take out or assassinate a particular individual who has done harm to society, or even something as mild as, what am I going to do with this particular thing? Should I take that piece of bread or not? For reasons like the lottery of birth, which we do not consent to and are essentially outside our locus of control, we believe strongly determine your outcome and capacity to do things. This becomes the ultimate arbiter of justice that motivates our side of the house. A few key points of setup we think are relevant for the best possible debate. Number one, for once, we'll be able to quantify and arbitrate the complexity of human behavior, which is ultimately dependent on things like money, on status, on circumstance, things which far too long have been so complicated for humanity to be able to explain, and we can only do things in hindsight in an ivory tower, wherein someone can say, oh, if I was in that situation, I would have done this, etc., etc. The harm that we exist happens in status quo is that innocent individuals are essentially screwed over by people, in the majority, for instance, people who are of elites, but now we uniquely have the chance to be able to remove that. Secondly, what happens on our side of the house is the preservation of human nature through the perpetuation and crystallization of true choice and agency. If someone, by virtue of free will, chooses to do a particular act that goes against what the majority of society and human experience want, this now ultimately becomes a true and valid choice out of the entirety of the possibilities of what that particular individual did. And the ultimate end here is that that choice is essentially justified, and they can face the trade-off of that particular choice when they are punished accordingly. We think that in status quo, these particular individuals will be punished essentially to the severity of their particular transgression. Meaning, if they did something super duper grand in terms of like killing a political candidate or doing something insane like that, even though it's justified because society wanted to do it, then they'll be punished accordingly, or on the counterfactual, not doing so. It will be proportional. Lastly is that this is ultimately also going to be dynamic and evolving with the context depending on what happens to these particular people and how society evolves. Case in point, certain value sets that we have today were very, very much different than what we had in the past, and people should be punished accordingly in violation to what happens now. But before that, opening opposition, go ahead. But now, what we see uniquely happens is that the numbers are essentially going to make up for it. Because we believe majority of rational individuals, regardless of what culture, race, or ethnicity you have, are essentially gravitating towards a certain universal code of morality. And that universal code of morality is essentially at the heart of this technology that ultimately is better than the existing criminal justice system we have now that is ultimately fractured. What do you get on our side? We finally have an accurate and ultimate arbiter of choice which ultimately is able to bring justice to the particular situation. Why is that? It's precisely because of the reasons they mentioned in the POI. There are so many complexities in status quo that determine whether or not a particular individual would do such a thing. But now if we're able to measure the entire world in terms of what the majority would do, assuming feasibility given in the info slide for the best possible debate, then a particular person then is now going to be held accountable to that standard. So if that person violates this particular action, which majority of society now dictates as something that they ought not to do, that person now essentially then becomes the ultimate threat and attack against society. This isn't going to be perfect. We tell you shit's gonna happen for sure in this particular side, but these things are something we're willing to defend in order to push agency farther. Closing, I'll take you if you have anything. Go ahead. We think you still, of course, make a decision based on your own metric, but now when this is juxtaposed against what majority of humanity would do, it becomes a true celebration of choice and agency. That is to say that if I choose to kill this particular individual, but majority of society said not to, for whatever reason that might be, it becomes the ultimate exercise of that choice, and I now have the agency and accountability to do that and should be punished accordingly. That is as opposed to what happens in status quo, wherein people are screwed over by things they cannot control and are ultimately at the mercy of all the subjective things that side opposition is going to tell you. The marginal benefit you have on our side is that at least this is going to be counter-checked and becomes the ultimate check and balance against humanity. What do you get from opening government? You ultimately get the best empathy and justice in terms of what really determines a human choice, and the further crystallization of that human choice when people violate or not violate human nature. We are very proud to open this debate.